Why do some characters feel real, while others feel like cardboard? Why do some stories feel like a series of events happening to the characters, while other stories feel like the events are happening because of the characters? You can have the most interesting premise in the world and still end up with a story that feels hollow, because the plot is doing all the work and not the characters. The story drags them from scene to scene and they just kind of react. But the stories that hit the hardest feel the opposite way. The plot isn't carrying the characters, because their personalities are what create the decisions, and those decisions create the story. Obviously, there are external factors that come into play, but it's how the characters react to these factors that should carry the story. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what I like to call the personality trio: strengths, flaws, and neutral traits, and how to actually use them in scenes. Note that this is part 2 in my Shaping Character series. In part 1, we focus more on designing a cast that creates natural tension and cause and effect interactions, where characters clash, pressure each other, and basically make the scenes more interesting by existing in the same room. But now we're going to be zooming in on something more fundamental: how to make a single character feel three-dimensional instead of lifeless and bland. And a quick warning: a character can feel real in your head as a writer, but it might not translate to the audience, because you're filling in the gaps automatically, but the audience can't. So first we'll break down strengths, flaws, and neutral traits individually, and then we'll tie them together into something that you can actually use to generate decisions, conflict, and plot. So first up, strengths. Most writers start by designing strengths, especially for their protagonist, and that's for a logical reason. If you start by designing the flaws, then you risk forgetting to make the characters likable. Strengths are like the easy entry point for audience attachment. These can be embrace yourself, competence, charisma, skill, humor, determination, resourcefulness, courage, loyalty, leadership, emotional intelligence like de-escalation or empathy, reading people or compassion, softer skills like patience, optimism, discipline, self-control, detectiveness, integrity, creativity, curiosity, improvisation, amongst many others. You get the gist. Strengths help the audience understand why they should root for your characters. But a strength isn't just a good quality. A strength is a tool a character uses to solve problems. And the moment a character has these tools, their story has a style of problem solving. And that's not just voice and identity, but decisions too. In Arcane, at her core, Vi is a protector. Her strengths are that she's brave, she's protective, she's direct, and she's action-oriented. She doesn't just process problems, she hits them right on the nose. That strength is what makes her watchable. It gives her scenes momentum. But in the next section, we'll also be talking about how her strengths can become flaws. In the Stormlight Archive by Brendan Sanderson, Kaladin's strength is his protectiveness and leadership. Dalinar is disciplined and responsible, he's built to carry kingdoms, and Shallan is clever and adaptive. Strengths aren't decorations for these characters. They are how they fight reality and try to stay sane. In Dune, Paul is intelligent, disciplined, and observant. He learns fast, he can read people, power, and the mood of a room like it's a second language, and he's built to see these patterns and anticipate threats. He is restrained where most people would lash out, and he carries himself with a kind of controlled intensity that makes others take him seriously before he's even done anything. And that's exactly why Paul's greatest strength is his doom. His mind is built to track the weight of choices, and the better he gets at understanding consequences, at seeing how one decision can ignite 10 more, the same strength corners him into paths where every option costs something. Because once you're the person who can actually see the domino chain, once you understand politics, violence, belief, and power well enough to predict how they spread, you stop getting offered clean choices. You get offered trade-offs. His clarity doesn't save him from consequence, it makes him responsible for it. He becomes the kind of leader who's constantly forced to choose between two horrors. Does he save the people right in front of him, knowing that one merciful choice could light the fuse on a war that kills millions? Or does he make the cold but necessary decision to prevent the worst outcome, knowing he'll still be responsible for the bodies it takes to get there? Because that's a trap. Once you're responsible for consequences on that scale, you stop choosing between good and bad, and you start choosing between catastrophes. Paul ultimately chooses the supposed necessary path. He takes power by seizing the throne and embracing his larger role as a false messiah to try to steer and contain the catastrophe. But he can't truly stop the jihad. He becomes complicit in it. Which brings us to our next point. A strength is only interesting if it has a cost, a dark side, or a limit. So, flaws and weaknesses. Sometimes even published writers forget to balance strength with weaknesses, and they forget to give their protagonists genuine flaws that hinder them. And when that happens, the character can become flat, because there's no internal friction. Strengths are what make you root for the character, but flaws are what makes them compelling to watch. And flaws do 3 massive things. First, they create unpredictability with logic. This isn't randomness, but inevitability. The audience can see the warning signs. They can see the better option sitting right there, and they still think, don't do it, but of course they're going to do it. because they also understand, given who this person is, their insecurity, their pride, temper, fear, or need for control, there's no way they're going to choose a sensible path. And if done right, this can be what makes the story compelling and exciting to watch, because the audience can see the collision coming. They're bracing for how bad it will be. And when it finally happens, it doesn't feel like the writer forced drama. It feels like the story is honestly following the character's internal logic to its consequences. Second, flaws create plot consequences, meaning the plot has to respond to the actions generated by this flaw. If your character makes a reckless call, lies, hesitates, overreacts, or pushes too hard, the story shouldn't just move on. That flaw should change the situation, escalate the stakes, damage a relationship, close an option, or create a new problem that wouldn't exist if someone else were in their place. And if a character's choices don't backfire sometimes, the story stops feeling real. And third, they create internal change. A character arc can't exist without something to overcome, refine, or tragically lean into. And you'll see that characters without flaws quickly become boring to watch. A couple of examples for this, such as the always right leader, who's rarely wrong, rarely apologizes, and rarely loses, if ever. The pure saint, the morally perfect but dramatically inert. The effortless chosen one, such as the Mary Sue. And in case you don't know, the Mary Sue is usually a type of female character who's depicted as unrealistically lacking in flaws or weaknesses. Suddenly they're amazing at fighting, or they're able to fly an unfamiliar aircraft on the spot, even though their background doesn't justify any of this. They haven't trained enough to merit winning against all the bad guys, and they've never learned how to fly this damned aircraft. These characters win because destiny or the writer said so, not because their choices cost them anything. And you can also have the invincible power fantasy protagonist, who has no meaningful internal limitation and no decision-making trade-off, such as the atrocity done to Mulan's character in the live-action adaptation, where the writers took away all the strengths and flaws that made her wins feel earned. Instead of watching a character become strong through cost and choice, we're just watching the story confirm that she was special all along and she didn't even have to try. Not to mention they add magic. Why? And in the vein of strengths, similarly, a lot of writers treat antagonists like they should be built off of flaws first, usually because they want to make them unlikable. But even if that's a common instinct, it's also a trap. Every character should have both strengths and flaws, because a villain with no strengths is boring too, and a hero with no flaws is a placeholder. One of the fastest ways to design compelling flaws is to show how easily strengths can become weaknesses. Sometimes it's a strength taken too far, and sometimes a strength just creates a blind spot. And it's important to note that a flaw is often a survival strategy that used to work. In Arcane, Vi's protectiveness becomes over-control, acting without thinking first, impulsivity, and rapid escalation, punching the problem in the face even when the problem becomes the very thing she was trying to protect. In Breaking Bad, Walter White's competence and pride become ego, domination, and obsession. His strength doesn't just help him win, it teaches him what winning feels like, and that becomes an addiction. And that's why Breaking Bad is so compelling to watch, because you're waiting for the protagonist's downfall. The audience is both rooting for him to succeed, to get away with everything, and they're rooting for him to have his comeuppance. In the Star Wars prequels, Anakin Skywalker's devotion and love quickly become attachment and fear of loss, which hardens into rigid control that creates one of the most famous examples of the fall of a hero trope, which we'll go over later. And without going too much into spoilers, in Attack on Titan, Eren Yeager's greatest strength is his conviction and drive for freedom. He cannot accept a cage, and he's willing to act when everyone else is still rationalizing, negotiating, or waiting for permission. But that same strength flips into a weakness through tunnel vision. His conviction hardens into absolutism, a mindset where compromise feels like surrender, hesitation feels like betrayal, and the longer the fight goes on, the more freedom narrows into one specific outcome he refuses to let go of. So in essence, his drive for freedom creates his refusal to compromise, which leads to escalation, which leads to extremity. And in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, every strength is double-edged and narratively weaponized. Here, strengths are never just cool traits. They're narrative levers. A character's best trait will save them in one scene and ruin them in the next. So Kaladin's strength is protectiveness and leadership, so the part of him that can't stop trying to save other people. And that strength makes him heroic, but it also makes him vulnerable to guilt, to impossible standards, and to breaking under pressure. While Dalinar's strengths are his discipline and responsibility, these traits can turn into rigidity, control, and moral tunnel vision. Shallan is clever and adaptive, but the same mental flexibility that helps her survive makes her unravel. Here's a useful tool I like to call the flaw to decision chain. In short, it's a plot structure where a flaw leads to a bad assumption, which leads to an action. It's a practical way to use flaws in scenes. Because a flaw isn't interesting if it's just a label on a character sheet. A flaw is interesting when it produces a predictable mistake. Mizu's main flaw in Blue Eye Samurai is her obsession and inability to let go. Her bad assumption is, if I slow down or form attachments, I lose. And the action that generates is that she pushes people away, escalates everything, and takes the most dangerous route. And that's how you turn traits into plot. And the third segment of the trio, neutral traits. The secret to voice and micro-conflict. Neutral traits are personality defaults that aren't inherently good or bad until context weaponizes them. They're the texture traits. Not strengths and weaknesses like being brave or cowardly, but these are more traits like bluntness, cautiousness, conflict avoidance, shyness, shamelessness, sense of formality, flirtatiousness, a sense of privacy, playfulness, theatricality, perfectionism, or high risk tolerance. Mizu from Blue Eye Samurai is a great example because so much of her presence is texture and not morality. Like her low social softness, the way she's emotionally contained, she's hyper-focused, she's impatient with detours, and she has an intensity that makes even normal conversations feel like confrontations. Neutral traits are how you get distinctive voice, micro-conflict, and chemistry without needing explosions or betrayals. Micro-conflicts can stem from characters clashing, one character being blunt while the other is diplomatic, and they have to work together to solve a problem. They're not enemies, but they're constantly stepping on each other's methods. Or through singular characters, such as a character defined by their independence. In one scene, it can read like competence, but in another, it can read like refusal to accept help. Or a risk taker. It can save them in one scene, and in another it can create collateral damage. So you can use neutral traits to quietly generate friction inside dialogue so your scenes feel alive. And now that we've established what these three traits are, how do we go about generating them and using them narratively? First, how to structure them. Every writer has their own technique, but personally, when I write a book, I write down the strengths, flaws, and neutral traits for each major character like a list. The more important to the story they are, the more traits I get. This is an example of my two main characters from one of my books. Look how much detail I put into them. I also go deeper into each characteristic further below in my notes. And this helps me understand my characters and all their contradictions. In another video, I'll go over the other traits that you should give to your characters, like skills, anti-skills, habits, a core title, like who they are at their core, what their narrative voices sound like internally, their motivations and core needs, their rooms for improvement, and how to make logical contradictions. Because like us, they should feel human too. I know this is a lot to take in, so that's why we're starting here. The deeper you dive into your characters, the more you understand them at a fundamental level, and the easier you can use their traits narratively. Note that you can decide on all these traits and never explicitly show them to the audience. It can be purely for you as a writer, just a tool that shapes how you write your characters. And secondly, if you start drafting or writing and you realize that some traits don't fit in with the rest of the character, or they just don't feel right, and it's okay to change them. Characters tend to become clearer the more you write them, but noting them all down helps you as a writer shape how you're writing the characters. And a couple of tips here. First, a consistency tool for drafting or writing a chapter, especially early on. Reread your list so you don't forget a major trait halfway through the story. Or you can make a simple version of this, like writing a one-liner or a couple of traits to keep you oriented and put them at the top of your document or at the top of every chapter. And this is especially useful if it's your first time writing these characters. If you're writing a whole series, the more you write, the less you'll need these sorts of reminders because you'll already know them at their core. And an exercise tip, especially for beginners, you can write the same story beat twice. First, by having a character solve it with their strength, and second, they solve it through a flaw, or their flaw makes the situation worse. And this can teach you to generate consequences on command. Now, how to balance these traits out to create an engaging character. Here we'll be focusing on redeeming counterweights. While you don't want to make a flawless protagonist, you also don't want to make them so flawed that they become unlikable and the audience checks out. Even if the audience wants them to fall, you still want to also have the audience root for them. But here's a key distinction. The goal isn't always to make the audience approve of them, it's to make the audience engage. A character can be a mess, but still be addictive to watch if you give them counterweights like charisma, competence, humor, vulnerability, or a personal code. In Arcane, Jinx is full of flaws. She's volatile, paranoid, self-destructive, and yet she's arguably the most popular character in Arcane and League of Legends. Why? Because she's emotionally raw, fascinating, and every scene she enters spikes the tension. By the way, another YouTuber called Shni makes great analyses of Arcane characters if you want a deeper dive into them. In Breaking Bad, Walter White isn't likable in the traditional sense, but his competence, willpower, and presence create momentum, so you don't want him off the screen. And in the Kingkiller Chronicles, you learn right from the start that Kvothe is a fallen legend, that whatever greatness he once had is already over, and you're watching a man who's ended up in hiding, living under a quieter name, telling you the story of how he got there. He's incredibly gifted right from the start, he's brilliant, charismatic, and relentlessly driven, the kind of protagonist that can walk into a room and make you believe he's destined to be legendary. But the story keeps you engaged by also treating those strengths as liabilities. His talent feeds his ego, his confidence pushes him into reckless choices, and his need to prove himself keeps creating consequences that eventually he can't talk his way stay out of. In all these cases, suspensive disbelief comes into play, because in real life, these are exactly the sort of people you'd be rooting against. That's why fiction has to pay you back in a different currency. If they're not morally admirable, then they have to be narratively irresistible, magnetic, fascinating, brutally competent, emotionally raw, or the kind of character who instantly raises the tension and stakes of every scene they enter. Okay, so you've built your strengths, your flaws, and your neutral traits. Now what? This is the part where character design turns into story engine. First, you need to understand how traits create decisions. Character-driven plots tend to be far more engaging than plot-driven ones, because the story isn't happening to the characters, it's being generated by their decisions. The audience can track a clear chain of cause and effect. Action A happened, and because this character is the kind of person they are, they chose action B, which creates the next problem. Remember what we said at the start. You don't want the plot to carry the characters. You want the characters' decisions to create the plot. A good scene is basically someone wants something, and their personality determines the method. If a character is proud, they refuse help. If they're paranoid, they misread an ally. If they're blunt, they start a fight they didn't need. And if they're protective, they lie for your own good. That's plot. Not because the writer decided it, but because the way you set up the character, they couldn't have done anything else. Second, you can use growth arcs. This is where flaws become tools. It's when characters are forced to confront their own selves. And like I mentioned in the flaw to decision chain, flaws can lead to a bad assumption, which then leads to action. The core of a growth arc is rewriting the bad assumption. A growth arc is what happens when, over repeated pressure, the character is forced to notice a pattern. They recognize and are able to name the flaw. The character then learns to rewrite the bad assumption, and thus they choose a better course of action. Their arc isn't that they become nicer, it's that their internal logic changes. And remember that strengths that quickly turn into flaws don't disappear in character growth arcs, they just get tempered. A common writing mistake is to treat growth as flaw removed, but what usually feels more real is the strength stays and the flaw doesn't vanish overnight, but the character learns restraint, timing, and awareness. The character's best trait is still there, but now it's under conscious management instead of unconsciously driving them over a cliff. And the plot engine of growth is repeated tests and one decisive pivot. In practicality, you build growth by designing tests that target the flaw's assumption. A clean way to think about this is setup shows the default behavior, their old solution. Escalation, the same behavior keeps working until the costs stack. A mirror moment, where the character is forced to see the pattern, usually via consequence or losing something, and a pivot choice. The character makes one decision differently, and it matters. This is because arcs land hardest when there's a decisive pivot that permanently alters relationships and stakes. And growth arcs are powered by three things. Want, the emotional hunger, fear, why they think they can't have it, and the mask, the behavior they use to hide the fear. And growth is often the moment the mask stops functioning. For example, a flaw can be, I need control. The bad assumption can be, if I don't control things, I'll lose what I love. The default action can be the lie, the manipulation, or the overreaching. The growth is how the story proves the assumption false. The new assumption can be control isn't safety, but trust and honesty are. And the new action can be to delegate, to admit fear, or to ask for help. But it's still hard and it's still costly. And this is where neutral traits can come in handy. Neutral traits are important for character growth arcs because they let the character change their inner logic without turning into a completely different person. A character can still stay blunt, conflict avoidant, perfectionist, or shameless, but they learn to aim those traits better or recognize when they're using them as armor. On the flip side, you can also use a downfall arc, where strength becomes their doom. It's the same trio, but in the opposite direction of a growth arc. This is basically the fall of a hero trope. A downfall arc is when a character's strengths keep solving external problems, while their flaw keeps destroying their internal life, until those two things collide. In short, downfall arcs happen when a strength creates a win, the win reinforces the flaw escalates the method burns bridges, and the character doubles down. For Walter White, its competence leads to pride, leads to control, leads to destruction. For Anakin Skywalker, its love leads to fear, leads to control, leads to tragedy. And for Paul Atreides, vision leads to inevitability, leads to doom. So how to do this? First, you pick the virtue that will become the weapon. Choose one or two core strengths the audience initially roots for, and decide how they'll solidify into the character's doom. Step 2, define the flaw to decision engine early. Write the character's patterns as flaw leads to bad assumption leads to action. Downfall arcs work when we keep watching the same inner logic produce bigger and bigger mistakes. Step 3, the reward phase. Let the flaw work at first. Early wins are crucial because the audience learns why the character keeps choosing this path. Make the method effective and then addictive. Step 4, escalate through cost, not randomness. Each win should charge a higher price. Relationships, morality, identity, or safety. The character adapts by doubling down and not by learning. Step 5, design a point of no return choice. This is one choice where they could still turn back, but they don't. This is the pivot that locks the trajectory. And finally, pay it off with the correct downfall. The ending should feel inevitable. Not the plot punished them, but their own pattern finally cashed in. And finally, after you've learned how traits create decisions, after you learned how to use the downfall arc or the growth arc, understand how to use neutral traits to shape relationships and create chemistry. Neutral traits are relationship glue and friction, a blunt character plus a sensitive character, a theatrical character plus a stoic character, a risk taker, and a planner. These are often character foils, which I went over in my first video of the series. Basically, foils are characters whose contrasting traits or belief sharpen another character's personality or values. Foils accentuate differences, so even when they share goals, their methods clash, and that generates constant scene tension without needing contrived drama. So, if you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Don't design characters like they're just a list of good and bad traits. Design them like a chain reaction. Strengths are how they fight, flaws are how they lose, and neutral traits are how they sound, how they move, and how they create friction even in normal conversations. So if you watched up to here, I'll probably be posting a poll with ideas for my next video to see what you guys are more interested in. I have a lot of ideas planned out for world building, character design, plot, and writing itself, but it's useful to get your feedback to see what's more relevant to you guys as writers. So thanks so much for your positive feedback on my previous video, and keep watching.